The dust motes in the afternoon light were my most constant companions, dancing in the narrow shafts that pierced the gloom of my study. Here, amidst the scent of aged paper and leather-bound atlases, I charted forgotten coastlines and meticulously inked the ghost towns of empires long dissolved. My days unfolded in a quiet, deliberate rhythm, each stroke of the pen a meditation, each rediscovered cartouche a small triumph over oblivion. The world beyond my window, a blur of urban gray, rarely intruded upon my meticulous solitude. I was Marcus, a cartographer of the past, content to inhabit the echoes of distant lands. Then came the envelope. Its stark cream linen stood out against the sepia tones of my usual correspondence. A sharp, unwelcome anomaly. The crest, a familiar but seldom seen heraldry of my estranged family, was stamped with the grim authority of a solicitor's office. I sliced it open with the same precision I used to unroll a brittle parchment. A faint tremor in my fingers that I attributed to the sudden disruption of my routine. The words inside were stark, unyielding. Deepest regrets. Disappearance. Presumed deceased. My aunt, a woman I remembered only as a distant, angular presence, had vanished from her remote Highland estate. There was no body, no explanation, only an empty house and the chilling finality of her absence. And then, the true weight of the communication. The estate, a sprawling, decrepit monument to forgotten grandeur, was now mine. A peculiar stillness settled over me, heavier than the dust in the air. Not grief, for our bond had long since frayed into nothingness, but a cold, academic curiosity. My aunt had been a woman of eccentricities, her life a closed book even to her closest kin. Now that book, or at least its crumbling cover, was in my possession. The idea of venturing into that forgotten corner of the world, of stepping into the quiet vacuum she'd left, held a morbid fascination. It was a blank space on my personal map, demanding to be filled. The journey north was a slow unwinding of the familiar. The concrete arteries of the city dissolved into rolling green, then into the stark, bruised purple of heather-clad moorland. Rain, a fine, persistent mist, began to fall as the train burrowed deeper into the Scottish Highlands, painting the landscape in shades of gray and bruised violet. Each passing mile seemed to peel back a layer of my accustomed reality, revealing something older, wilder beneath. My thoughts drifted to the estate, a place I had visited only once in a hazy childhood, a collection of vague, unsettling impressions. And most vividly, I remembered a disorienting sensation, a subtle displacement. Even as a child, I had felt it. The house was a childhood home, slightly wrong rooms in the wrong order. A staircase that should have led to the kitchen instead opened onto a narrow, unused landing. A door to a linen closet might, in a trick of memory or light, seem to conceal a passage to somewhere else entirely. It was a feeling of architectural dissonance, a deliberate misdirection that made the very structure feel imbued with a quiet, unsettling sentience. The train rattled on, its rhythm a hypnotic thrum against the rising wind. Outside, the last vestiges of civilization thinned to scattered crofts, their windows like single, watchful eyes in the vast emptiness. The sky overhead was a bruised canvas, heavy with impending twilight. I felt a prickle of unease, a premonition that had nothing to do with the journey itself, but with the destination. When the conductor, a man whose face was etched with the harsh lines of the northern weather, called out my stop, the sound was almost a whisper in the echoing carriage. I was the only one to disembark at the tiny, desolate station, a single lamp casting a feeble yellow circle against the encroaching gloom. The air here was sharp, biting, carrying the wild, untamed scent of the sea, even though the coast was still miles away. A solitary vehicle, a battered Land Rover, waited by the station house. Its driver, a gruff, elderly local, merely nodded when I approached, his gaze unreadable beneath the brim of his cap. He did not speak, nor did I. The journey from the station to the estate was a slow crawl along a winding track, barely more than a sheep path. The Land Rover's headlamps cut twin beams through the thickening fog, illuminating fleeting glimpses of gnarled trees and jagged rock formations that seemed to hunch in the mist, like ancient sleeping beasts. The isolation was absolute. The world outside the vehicle's windows was a deepening monochrome, a blurred tapestry of grays and blacks, pierced only by the anemic glow of the headlights. A profound sense of vulnerability settled upon me, a feeling of being utterly untethered from the world I knew. I was no longer Marcus, the cartographer of the past, but a solitary figure venturing into a territory that felt less like a physical place and more like a threshold. The estate, a phantom looming in the fog, awaited, and with it perhaps an answer to a disappearance or a deeper, more unsettling question. My determination, once a steady flame, now flickered with a nascent tension. But today, the familiar comfort of my work felt like a flimsy veil, barely concealing the unsettling truth that now pulsed through the very foundations of this inherited desolation. My aunt's disappearance, the inexplicable silence that followed, had left a vacuum, and into that vacuum now flowed a morbid curiosity, a strange compulsion to understand the currents that had swept her away. This place, her estate, was supposed to be my childhood home. Yet each creaking floorboard, each shadowed corner resonated with a subtle dissonance. The rooms were in the wrong order, not physically shifted, but somehow rearranged in my memory. A disquieting architectural anachronism. A staircase that should have led to a sunlit landing now terminated in perpetual twilight. A window I remembered overlooking a sprawling garden now framed only a tangled thicket of gnarled branches. It was a familiar shell, warped by an unseen force, and it called to me, promising answers it might be better not to find. The air here was thick with the scent of decay. Not just the slow rot of wood and fabric, but something else, something metallic and faint, like old coins left to corrode in a forgotten drawer. Their gazes were not judgmental, but vacant, as if their souls had long since departed, leaving behind only the painted veneer. Every room I passed was a testament to this, a haphazard museum of the unsettling. A taxidermied owl perched on a stack of crumbling folios, its glass eyes gleaming with an unnatural alertness. A collection of intricate silver filigreed boxes, each sealed with a tiny rusted padlock, sat on a dusty sideboard, their contents a tantalizing mystery. I ran a gloved hand over a tapestry depicting a landscape not found on any map I knew. Its threads faded to muted tones of ochre and bruised violet. The patterns were intricate, almost hypnotic, hinting at structures that defied known architectural styles, impossibly ancient and alien. The kitchen, when I finally reached it, was frozen in time, a half-eaten meal still on the table, covered in a fine film of dust. It was a tableau of sudden departure, a moment interrupted, not concluded. The absence here was louder than any presence could be, a gaping maw in the domestic scene. I felt a prickle on the back of my neck, the sensation of being watched, not by the painted eyes, but by the very fabric of the house itself, a silent, assessing presence. Past the drawing room, where the grand piano stood silent, its keys yellowed like old teeth. Past the library, its shelves overflowing with volumes bound in strange leathers, titles in forgotten languages. It was behind one of these imposing floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that my fingers, tracing the spine of a particularly dense tome, felt a subtle give. Not the give of a loose board, but the faint, almost imperceptible click of something recessed. I pushed, and with a soft groan of aged wood and protesting hinges, a section of the bookshelf swung inward, revealing a narrow, unlit passage. I retrieved a heavy brass lantern from the nearby hall, its flames sputtering to life with a faint hiss. The light cut a trembling swathe through the inky blackness, illuminating a cramped, hidden study. This was it. The walls were lined with more shelves, but these held not literature, but a chaotic array of artifacts. Bone fragments etched with incomprehensible symbols, petrified wood twisted into unnatural shapes, charts of constellations that didn't align with any known celestial map. There were notebooks filled with frantic, looping script, diagrams of impossible geometries, and pressed specimens of flora I'd never encountered in any botanical text. A large, heavy desk dominated the center of the room, littered with research materials. Parchment scrolls, their edges frayed, lay unrolled beside a magnifying glass. A leather-bound journal, its pages brittle with age, lay open, a spidery drawing of an elongated serpentine creature adorning one page. My gaze, however, was drawn to the object beneath a scattered pile of these documents. It was not a scroll, nor a book, but a map, unlike any I had ever seen. I reached for it, my fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against its surface. It was not paper, nor vellum, but something else entirely. A material that felt impossibly thin, yet possessed the rigidity of a dried leaf with a texture like finely grained stone. Its edges were ragged, as if torn from a larger whole, and its coloration was a muted sepia tone, yet imbued with an almost luminous quality in the lantern light. Spread out on the desk, it depicted a section of ocean, familiar in its contours of the North Sea. But then, there it was, an island. An island that simply did not exist. Its shape was jagged, unnatural, like a shard of obsidian thrust violently from the depths. No soundings, no navigational markers, no familiar land masses adjacent to it. Just this impossible island, marked with a single indecipherable symbol at its heart, a spiral within a triangle, pulsing with a silent, malevolent energy. The map was ancient, impossibly so, yet detailed with an eerie precision. This was no cartographic error, no fanciful drawing. And now it had found me. The parchment, aged and brittle, had taken root in my mind. It lay splayed across my large mahogany desk, a beacon in the shifting dust motes that danced in the anemic light of the study. The scent of ancient paper, a delicate mix of dry earth and forgotten ink, clung to my fingertips, even after I'd carefully rolled it away and back again, a dozen times over. The island, an impossible blot upon the North Sea, pulsed with an unseen current, drawing my gaze, stealing my breath. Sleep became a distant memory, a vague concept for lesser men. My days blurred into nights, marked only by the shifting quality of the light that filtered through the tall, grimy windows. The world outside, the desolate highlands, the biting wind, the ceaseless cry of gulls, all faded into an indistinct hum. There was only the map and the island. Its contours, etched with an unsettling precision, seemed to shift, to breathe under my scrutiny. I traced its shores, my finger a ghost ship on its unknown waters, feeling a strange pull, a cold resonance in my bones. My aunt's journals, a stack of leather-bound volumes filled with her elegant, spidery script, became my new liturgy. I devoured them, searching for any clue, any whisper of this impossible place. Most entries were mundane, observations on flora and fauna, musings on the changing light. But then, scattered like hidden traps, I found them. Of a shore where the gulls cease their cry and the waves lick at something not of this world. Another, a brittle, yellowed newspaper clipping tucked between pages, detailed the disappearance of a fishing trawler, lost without a trace in a storm that no other vessel reported. The coordinates mentioned in the article were disturbingly close to the island's phantom location. A rational mind, a mind not yet consumed, would have seen them as warnings, portents of ill. But my mind, now a prisoner of the map, dismissed them. Superstition, I told myself. The ramblings of an eccentric woman, the tragic fate of an ill-equipped vessel. And the sea, after all, was a cruel mistress, claiming its due without need of ancient curses. My cartographer's discipline, once a shield against such irrationality, had become a weapon turned upon myself, fueling an insatiable need to chart the unknown, to correct this glaring error in the fabric of the world. The house itself seemed to participate in my growing disorientation, a silent accomplice to my unraveling. Each creak of the floorboards, each groan of the ancient timbers, was a beat in the drum of my obsession. I found myself in the old pantry, a room that should have been off the kitchen but now seemed to open directly into a disused conservatory, searching for old sailing charts, for anything that might shed light on this blank space. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone and forgotten spices. My hands, once steady and precise, now trembled with a feverish energy as I began to prepare. Old sea charts, their edges frayed, were pulled from their dusty rolls. I compared currents, charted prevailing winds, calculated distances. My small, sturdy cutter, docked in the nearest coastal town, would need provisions, fresh rigging, a thorough check of its ancient diesel engine. I meticulously listed equipment: compasses, sextants, depth sounders, emergency beacons. The few local fishermen I encountered during my supply runs, weathered, silent men with eyes like distant horizons, offered me only wary glances when I spoke of the North Sea's more remote stretches. A taciturn shopkeeper, his face a roadmap of wind and sun, merely grunted when I inquired about old tales of uncharted land. "Some places," he'd rasped, his voice like stones tumbling, "are best left unbothered, lad." My resolve remained unyielding. Their fear was born of ignorance, of superstition. My quest was for knowledge, for truth, for the satisfaction of seeing a blank space filled, a mystery resolved. The map, now my constant companion, was folded carefully and tucked into the breast pocket of my jacket. I could feel its presence, a weight against my heart, a constant thrumming reminder of the journey ahead. The tension in my body was a coiled spring, ready to release, ready to embark. The world had shrunk, distilled down to a single point, a single destination. The salt-laced wind, a harsh caress, tugged at my hair as I secured the last of the provisions. My small vessel, a sturdy, deep-keeled cutter I had meticulously prepared, bobbed impatiently against the weathered dock pilings. Behind me, the estate loomed, a silhouette against the bruised morning sky, its gables and turrets a familiar ache in my periphery. That insidious sense of displacement had fueled my resolve, sharpening my focus on the journey ahead. The map, now carefully laminated and tucked into a waterproof pouch, pulled me with an almost physical force. It was a compass not just to an island, but to an understanding I desperately craved. The engine coughed to life, a low rumble that vibrated through the deck beneath my boots, a sound of purposeful industry against the vast, indifferent silence of the Highlands. I cast off the lines, the ropes hissing as they slipped free, and the cutter, named the Cartographer, in a moment of ironic self-awareness, nudged away from the land. The mainland receded, its craggy contours blurring into a charcoal smudge, then disappearing entirely into the rolling gray of the horizon. For the first few hours, the North Sea was merely formidable. Its waves, though substantial, were predictable, a rhythmic heave and fall that tested the cutter's resilience but offered no true surprise. The sky, a vast canvas of churning gray, pressed down, mirroring the leaden depths beneath. I gripped the helm, my knuckles white, the spray a constant cold baptism across my face. The world narrowed to the thrum of the engine, the shriek of the wind, and the endless heaving expanse of water. Here, there was no distant bark of a shepherd's dog, no faint wail of a passing train, only the raw, elemental roar of the sea. As the day waned, bleeding into a twilight that seemed to offer no transition, the sea began to change. The waves no longer rolled with a predictable rhythm. They became erratic, spiteful, lashing out from unexpected directions, slamming against the hull with a jarring force that sent shivers through the cutter's frame. The wind, too, lost its steady howl, rising and falling in sudden, violent gusts that threatened to tear the sails from their mast and rip the very breath from my lungs. I fought the helm, muscles aching, eyes straining against the encroaching gloom. It wasn't an absence of sound, not entirely. The engine still thrummed, the wind still shrieked, the waves still crashed. But beneath, or perhaps within these sounds, a profound, unnatural quiet descended. It was as if the roar of the elements had been muted, muffled by some invisible, pervasive veil. My own breathing seemed unnaturally loud in my ears, the creak of the deck planks a jarring intrusion. It was in this unsettling quiet that the lights began. At first, I dismissed them as tricks of the eye, phosphorescence stirred by the cutter's bow wave, or perhaps distant fishing trawlers, though I knew I was far beyond any shipping lanes. But they were not beneath the waves. They were on the waves, or just above them, faint, diffuse glows that appeared and vanished without explanation. Not the sharp, focused beams of human vessels, but soft, pulsating emanations like submerged embers, rising briefly to the surface before sinking back into the depths. They were not clustered, but scattered, appearing in the distance, then closer, then winking out only to reappear minutes later, miles away. They had no discernible source, no visible form attached to them. They were simply light, unmoored and inexplicable. It was the distinct, undeniable feeling of being watched. Not from the distant land I'd left behind, nor from the empty sky above, but from within the vast, featureless expanse around me. My heart began a slow, heavy drum against my ribs, a rhythm of rising apprehension. This was not the sea I knew, not even at its most treacherous. What had I sailed into? What unseen eyes were tracing my lonely journey across this dead expanse? My gaze, drawn by an irresistible pull, fixed on the horizon ahead. It was indistinct, a mere suggestion, but it was there. The island. My breath hitched, a knot of ice forming in my stomach. The true journey, I realized with a sickening lurch, had only just begun. The last tendrils of the mainland's memory dissolved behind me, swallowed by the churning gray. For days, the world was a vast, indifferent expanse of water and sky. The only constant, the rhythmic slap of waves against my hull, a lullaby of isolation. My small cutter, a steadfast companion, cut through the swells with a quiet determination that mirrored my own. Then, a shift. The air, once sharp with the bite of the open sea, grew heavy, almost viscous. A perpetual twilight began to descend, not the gentle fade of dusk, but a premature dimming, as if the sun itself had turned its gaze away. A mist, thin and spectral at first, began to coil around the waves, obscuring the horizon, then thickening into an opaque shroud. It tasted of salt and something else. Something mineral, ancient, and cold. The familiar cries of gulls vanished. The sea, which had always hummed with life, fell silent, save for the muffled sigh of the mist against the water. Through this veil, the island emerged. Its cliffs rose sheer and black, draped in the shifting gray, like the shoulders of a slumbering titan. No lights, no sign of human habitation, just the raw, unyielding rock. The map had been precise. A narrow, hidden inlet, barely more than a cleft in the stone, offered the only passage. The keel grated softly on a bed of pebbles, a sound that echoed too loudly in the profound quiet. I cut the engine, and the silence descended, absolute and profound. Nothing. It was a vacuum, a place where sound itself seemed to be absorbed, devoured. I secured the lines to a jagged outcrop, my hands moving with a practiced efficiency that belied the tremor in my chest. Each click of the carabiner was a violent intrusion. The air was heavy, still, The mist swirled around my ankles, obscuring the ground just a few feet ahead. I could taste the mineral tang again, stronger now, like damp iron and something else I couldn't place. A subtle, earthy sweetness that hinted at decay. My breath plumed in the cold air, dissolving instantly, as if the island itself resented even that small disturbance. I took my pack, the weight familiar and grounding, and began to walk. The ground sloped gently upwards, leading into the heart of the island's embrace. There were no trees, no shrubs, only sparse, resilient lichens clinging to the rocks like pale green sores. The complete absence of animal life was unsettling. Not a single bird call, not the scurry of a small creature. It felt ancient, pre-life. As I ascended, the mist thinned slightly, offering fleeting glimpses of the landscape. And then I saw them. Not immediately, but gradually, as my eyes adjusted to the muted palette of gray and black. Colossal stones, not jagged like natural formations, but strangely smooth, worn by unimaginable ages. They stood, half-buried, in irregular patterns, like teeth broken from some gargantuan maw. Some were monoliths, rising 10 or 12 feet, their surfaces scarred with deep horizontal grooves, as if something immense had dragged itself across them, leaving trails of incomprehensible significance. Others were flat, table-like slabs, tilted precariously, their undersides revealing crude, geometric carvings that defied any known human script. My mind, accustomed to the logic of cartography, struggled to categorize what I was seeing. These were not geological markers, not cairns, not even the megaliths of ancient human cultures. They were too vast, too worn, too wrong. These were monuments, certainly, but to what? For whom? They spoke of an intelligence, or at least a shaping force, that predated not just humanity, but perhaps even the very concept of time as I understood it. I felt an irrational urge to turn back, to flee this place that radiated an ancient, malevolent indifference. I had come too far. My aunt's map, her cryptic legacy, had led me here, to this impossible shore. I had to understand. Every sense screamed that I did not belong here, that nothing living belonged here. Yet, I pressed on, my gaze fixed on the unnatural stones, each one a silent, terrible question etched into the heart of this desolate land. And I, Marcus, had finally arrived. The small vessel found its uneasy rest against the island's stony lip, a dark bruise upon the churning gray. I stepped onto the shingle, the crunch beneath my boots a stark declaration against the profound silence that swallowed the waves' murmur. My gaze swept across the barren landscape, a tapestry woven from skeletal rock and stubborn, wind-scoured moss. No birds cried, no insects hummed. I secured the cutter, its familiar lines a comfort, then shouldered my pack. The compass needle, usually a steadfast guide, quivered with an unsettling uncertainty, spinning a slow, aimless dance before settling on a direction that felt less like north and more like nowhere. The ground underfoot grew more uneven, the stones sharper, as if the island itself resented my intrusion. My own breathing seemed unnaturally loud, a ragged counterpoint to the island's mute refusal to acknowledge life. I felt observed, not by eyes, but by the very stones, by the air itself, a presence so diffuse it defied definition, yet so absolute it pressed upon my chest. Hours bled into a timeless continuum. The light, though never truly bright, began to wane, painting the mist in shades of bruised violet and gray. Then, through the thinning veil of vapor, it appeared. Not a peak, not a natural formation, but a monstrous silhouette, a jagged scar against the bruised sky. As I drew closer, the scale became terrifyingly apparent. It was a structure of cyclopean stones, each block the size of a small house, fitted with an impossible precision that defied both logic and known history. the surface was not merely weathered. It was worn, as if by eons of wind and a patience that transcended geological time. It was not built, but grown, an organic, yet utterly inorganic monstrosity. This was it. The culmination of the map, the strange inheritance, the ant's disappearance. A morbid curiosity, a powerful undertow dragged me closer. I found an opening, not a portal carved by tools, but a fissure, a vertical gash in the stone, as if the very rock had sagged open under an unbearable weight. My torch beam, a fragile spear of light, pierced the absolute blackness, revealing a vast, echoing chamber, its ceiling lost in the gloom. The walls were not smooth, but ridged with patterns, intricate and alien. They were not carvings, not symbols I recognized from any culture, but rather a language of form, a geometry that twisted the eye, making the stone seem to writhe. Lines spiraled into impossible angles, curves flowed into sharp, unnatural points, suggesting a purpose that lay far beyond human comprehension. My footsteps, muffled by the thick dust, seemed to reverberate with an unnatural loudness in my own skull. As I ventured deeper, a strange phenomenon began. The air shimmered, not with heat, but with an unseen vibration. Then, a flicker, a brief, disorienting shift in my perception. For a fleeting instant, the impossibly ancient stone hallway before me wavered, dissolving into a different space. The long, narrow corridor of the structure became, for a heartbeat, the hallway of my youth. But the door that should have led to the kitchen was now the entrance to my bedroom, and the staircase that should have ascended to the attic descended into a solid wall of plaster. The sense of profound dislocation was sickening, a sudden, violent wrenching of reality. Something here was awake, something ancient and vast, and it was reaching. The air grew heavier, a palpable weight on my shoulders. I was no longer alone in this echoing tomb. And now, it was awake. I moved inland, each step a deliberate intrusion upon the island's ancient stillness. The ground rose sharply, a tortured landscape of obsidian rock and sparse, wind-scoured scrub that clung to impossible fissures. No birds sang, no insects hummed. The only sound was the scuff of my boots, a lonely counterpoint to the profound, aching quiet. The sky above was a bruised canvas of perpetually overcast gray, mirroring the bleakness below. Then I saw it. The structure. It rose from the island's spine, a cyclopean wound in the earth, not built, but grown from the very rock. Its geometry was wrong, a series of impossible angles and non-Euclidean curves that defied the eye. Stone blocks, vast as cottages, formed walls that leaned inwards, creating a sense of crushing weight. It pulsed with an unquantifiable age, a history so deep it predated the concept of time. A maw-like entrance yawned open, a blackness deeper than the overcast sky. Hesitation warred with a morbid, irresistible pull. They seemed to shift at the periphery of my vision, the stone itself appearing to breathe. It was not words, not yet, but a presence, a vast, malevolent intelligence stirring from its slumber. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the sound resonated from within. My sense of direction began to fray. I walked, or so I thought, in a straight line, but the passages seemed to shift, to reconfigure themselves. A turn I remembered taking led to a different corridor. How long had I been walking? Hours? Days? The concept of time became fluid, stretching and contracting like a distorted image in rippled water. Then, as I stared at a particularly unsettling carving, the stone wall shimmered, losing its solidity. The cyclopean architecture dissolved, replaced by something achingly familiar, yet profoundly wrong. But the door to my mother's study was where the kitchen should have been, and the staircase ascended into an impossible, inky blackness. A window where I remembered a garden looked out onto the churning gray sea of the island. The beloved familiar was twisted, a grotesque parody. My breath caught, a raw, ragged sound in my throat. This was my home, but alien, rearranged by a malicious hand. Then, as quickly as it came, the hallucination receded, the familiar walls dissolving back into the ancient, impossible stone of the structure. The air felt thin, sharp, and I tasted copper on my tongue. My hand brushed against a small niche, hidden in a recess I swore had not been there moments before. Within it, nestled amongst a scattering of brittle, unidentifiable debris, lay a small, leather-bound journal. Its cover was water-stained, its pages warped, but the elegant script within was unmistakable. My aunt's. My hands trembled as I opened it, the brittle pages threatening to crumble. The entries were fragmented, scrawled with increasing desperation. It's not empty. It listens. It waits. The walls, they breathe. They shift. I see faces in the stone, ancient, eyeless. They crawl into my head. Not words, but concepts. Impossible truths. Her descent was playing out before me, a terrifying premonition of my own fate. I can't tell what is real. The house. It comes and goes. The rooms are wrong. The colors are wrong. It's a trick, a cruel joke. My breath hitched. He had seen it too. The same distorted echo of memory. The final entries were barely legible, a chaotic jumble of lines and desperate scribbles. It wants me to understand, to see, to accept. It's not just the island. It's everywhere now, inside me. I can feel it, stretching. The maps, they led me here. But the true map is not of land, but of oblivion. I am losing myself. My name. Who am I? They are my name now. The journal fell from my numb fingers, clattering softly on the stone floor. They were no longer indistinct, but a chorus of voices, ancient and alien, chanting a single terrifying truth. And now, the same insidious tide was rising within me, threatening to drown the last vestiges of Marcus. The journal lay splayed, a testament to a truth too vast, too cruel for its brittle pages. The single terrible word, half-formed on my tongue, dissolved into the cacophony. The whispers, no longer a distant hum, had coalesced into a roaring chorus within my skull. 1,000 ancient voices chanting terror. It was a sound that didn't just vibrate in my ears, but resonated through the very marrow of my bones, a symphony of psychic agony. My head throbbed, a drum beaten by an unseen hand, and the world began to tilt. I stumbled back, my hands flying to my ears, a futile gesture against the internal assault. The rough-hewn stone of the chamber wall scraped against my palms, grounding me for a fleeting second. I needed air. I needed silence. I needed to escape this terrible place, this cyclopean maw that seemed to swallow sound and light and sanity. My boots slipped on the uneven flagstones, slick with an unseen moisture. The air here was cooler, still, and stagnant, carrying the faint, unsettling scent of dust and long-dead flowers. My eyes, adjusting to the deeper gloom, struggled to make sense of my surroundings. This wasn't the tunnel. No, this was a hallway, a narrow, high-ceilinged corridor, wallpapered in a faded floral pattern I knew intimately. A pattern from my earliest memories. The walls themselves seemed to sigh, exhaling the stale scent of forgotten years. The layout was familiar, yet utterly distorted. A grandfather clock, its pendulum missing, stood where a coat rack should have been. A door, painted a vibrant, impossible blue, was set into the wall where the dining room archway always stood. Through it, I could see a sliver of what looked like the kitchen, but the light spilling from it was a sickly green, and the angles of the cabinets seemed to fold in on themselves. The chanting voices had faded, replaced by a low, persistent hum that vibrated in the floorboards beneath my feet. My heart hammered. a frantic drum against my ribs. This wasn't a hallucination born of exhaustion. This was a direct assault on my perception, an intrusion, a warping. I took a hesitant step forward, my hand reaching out to touch the familiar floral wallpaper. It felt like paper, cool and dry. Yet as my fingers traced the faded roses, a shiver ran through me. This was impossible. Yet here it was, a perverse mockery. It isn't haunting this place. It is this place, or it reshapes it. It's not a spirit bound by death, but something else entirely. The hum grew louder, a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to emanate from the very air. It fed on the order of things, on the predictable patterns of reality and thought, twisting them, consuming them. A new sound emerged from the green-lit kitchen door, a low, guttural moan laced with something that might have once been human speech, but was now utterly mangled. The moan intensified, and then a figure began to emerge from the impossible blue doorway. It was tall, gaunt, draped in what looked like a tattered dressing gown, but its form was wrong. The limbs were elongated, jointed at unnatural angles, and its head was tilted at a grotesque degree, a parody of recognition. It was my aunt, or what remained of her. Her face, though stretched and gaunt, was unmistakably hers, yet twisted into a rictus of perpetual agony and something far worse, a terrible silent hunger. Her mouth opened, not to speak, but to emit a sound that scraped against the edges of my soul, a sound of profound emptiness. And then I heard his voice, clear as a bell, yet layered with 1,000 other alien voices, echoing from the thing's distorted form, or perhaps from inside my own skull. He feeds on the edges, Marcus, on the gaps. He finds. The words were not meant for me, not truly. They were echoes, fragments of a mind consumed, played back by an entity that had devoured her, absorbed her, and was now using her as a puppet, a lure. The hum in the air intensified, vibrating through my teeth, and the floorboards beneath me began to creak and groan as if the entire structure were shifting, dissolving around me. The thing that was my aunt raised a skeletal, elongated hand, its fingers ending in black, sharpened nails. It pointed, not at me, but at the space just behind my eyes, at the very seat of my consciousness. And from its mouth, a new sound, a wet, sucking noise, as if it were drawing the very air from the room, or something far more vital from my own being. My reality was unraveling. The entity wasn't a ghost. It was a cosmic predator, a weaver of impossible spaces, a devourer of minds, and it was hungry. The floorboards beneath me ceased their groaning, the sound abruptly severed as if by an invisible blade. Yet the hum persisted, a deep thrumming that resonated not in the air, but within the very bones of my skull. My estranged aunt's voice, or what masqueraded as it, faded into that resonant silence, leaving behind only the chilling echo of its hollow deceit. It was a lure I knew, a puppet's final desperate dance. My breath hitched, a ragged intake of the cold, saline air that now seemed heavier, denser, tinged with something metallic and old. Escape. That was the only imperative. Not understanding, not cataloging, not even survival, but escape. This island, this structure, this thing. It was not merely ancient. It was alive, and it was malevolent. I turned, my movements stiff, my joints aching with a sudden, unnatural weariness. The path I had taken to reach this central chamber, the winding corridors of the decaying estate, should have been clear. The very architecture appeared to writhe, the angles subtly shifting, the familiar lines of the walls blurring, refusing to hold their form. My hand brushed against a wall, expecting the rough, peeling plaster. But instead, my fingers met smooth, cold stone, impossibly slick. This was not the estate's interior. I pushed forward, ignoring the growing unease, focusing on the distant, imagined glint of the sea, the promise of my small boat. The air grew thick with the scent of damp earth and something else. A faint, cloying sweetness, like overripe fruit left too long in the sun, mixed with the sharp tang of salt. I stumbled, my boot catching on an unseen root, and plunged forward, bracing for the impact. Instead of the hard ground, my hands met a plush velvet rug. I pushed myself up, my vision swimming, and found myself standing not on the island's rugged terrain, but within a hallway. A hallway that was achingly familiar, yet utterly wrong. A grandfather clock, its pendulum frozen, stood where a coat rack should have been. The small, cramped kitchen, which I recalled being directly off the living room, now lay beyond a door that should have led to my father's study. I pushed it open, and instead of the scent of old books and pipe tobacco, I was met with the cloying sweetness again, overwhelming now, mingled with the faint metallic tang. The room was empty, devoid of furniture, the floorboards warped and stained. And through the far wall, where a solid brick exterior should have been, I saw the churning gray of the North Sea. This wasn't an illusion painted on the air. It was a physical manifestation, a warping of reality so complete that my senses screamed in protest. This was the revealed discovery. The island itself was not merely host to the entity. It was an extension of it, a living, breathing prison, fashioned from the echoes of my own past. I staggered back, the walls of the home seeming to press in, their familiar patterns now menacing. The air grew heavy, the hum intensifying until it was a tangible pressure against my eardrums. I could feel the island breathing around me, a slow, deliberate expansion and contraction that resonated with the pulse in my own temples. It was playing with me, a cat with a mouse, twisting the familiar into the monstrous. I found the front door, a heavy oak slab that bore the scars of decades, and wrenched it open, desperate for the bracing wind, for the reality of the sea. But the world outside was not the windswept shore I yearned for. The path to the cove, the one I had memorized, the one that led to my salvation, was gone. Instead, a jagged, impossible cliff face rose before me, sheer and black, its summit lost in a perpetually swirling mist. Where the gentle slope of the shore should have been, a vast, froiling expanse of dark water stretched out, devoid of any discernible horizon, its surface boiling with an unnatural phosphorescent glow. My boat, my small vessel of hope, was nowhere to be seen. It was either swallowed by this impossible sea or simply rendered non-existent by the entity's will. I was cornered. The island, a living, malevolent consciousness, had drawn its tendrils around me, severing every escape route. The hum filled everything, vibrating through the ground, through the air, through my very bones, a triumphant, silent roar of possession. I was trapped, utterly and impossibly, on an island that was no longer just land and stone, but a boundless, sentient prison. The hum, once a vibration in bone, now coursed through the very marrow of my thoughts, a low, resonant drone that stripped away the edges of reality. The floorboards beneath my feet were no longer the ancient, salt-worn planks of the cyclopean structure, but a warped parody of the polished oak in my grandmother's hallway. The pantry, usually a cool, dark alcove off the kitchen, now opened directly into what should have been the drawing room, its familiar scent of spices replaced by a metallic tang, like old blood and rust. The drawing room itself, with its faded tapestry and grand fireplace, was skewed, its mantelpiece leaning at an impossible angle. The hearth filled not with ashes, but with a swirling, inky void that seemed to pull at the air. My own reflection, caught in a leaning mirror, showed eyes too wide, pupils dilated to black pits, skin stretched taut over sharp angles. The entity had finally dragged me into its domain, or perhaps it had merely peeled back the thin veneer of my sanity, revealing the raw, exposed nerve beneath. I could hear the phantom creak of a swing set from a long-lost summer afternoon, overlaid with the guttural grinding of impossible stone. My hand, trembling, went to the satchel still slung across my shoulder. Inside, nestled amongst my few remaining rations, was the map. I pulled it out, its parchment feeling unnaturally warm against my clammy fingers. In this place of shifting perceptions, the map was the only anchor. The island, the structure, they were not merely locations. The lines were not contours, the symbols not navigational markers. This was not a map to something, but a map of something. A diagram, a binding, a cage. And I, in my blind pursuit, had been peeling back the layers of that containment. A single stark line of my aunt's writing, previously dismissed as an obscure historical note, now flared with horrifying clarity. The architecture is the prison, its geometry, the lock, a suppression, and I, by disturbing the structure, by listening to its internal hum, had begun to unravel that key. The walls seemed to breathe, the floorboards rippled like water. The entity was aware of my dawning understanding, and it was displeased. My aunt's final, desperate notes, scribbled in a frantic hand along the map's edge, spoke of resealing, of a specific sequence of actions, a precise realignment of perceived space and sound to restore the binding. This was the event. My eyes darted around the surreal room, searching for a focal point. It was a gaping maw, a tear in reality. The hum emanated from it, a deep, guttural growl that promised oblivion. My aunt's last instruction was a series of gestures, a precise sequence of touches and utterances, meant to be performed within the heart of the structure. But I was not in the structure. I had to use the wrongness of this place against the entity. I placed my palm flat on the map, over the cyclopean structure, feeling the faint warmth of the parchment. The hum vibrated up my arm, a sickening resonance. My aunt's note spoke of a central point, a nexus. Then, with a sudden, horrifying insight, I realized the true central point. It wasn't the structure on the island. It was me. I was the one perceiving this reality. I was the one whose sanity was the battlefield. The entity was not merely trying to break out of a physical prison. It was trying to break into me, to inhabit my perception, to use my consciousness as its new conduit. My aunt hadn't been trying to seal a place. He had been trying to seal a connection. The choice was not merely death or oblivion. It was the horrific transformation, the complete subjugation of my identity. To become a living key, a sentient gateway for something ancient and malevolent. No, I would not allow it. I closed my eyes, focusing all my will, not on the map, but on the idea of the map, on the concept of the binding. I envisioned the lines and symbols of my aunt's diagram not as ink on parchment, but as veins of lead and iron, sealing, suppressing, silencing. I opened my eyes. The hum was deafening. The distorted room was a kaleidoscope of agony. I raised my hand, not to touch the map. I poured every ounce of my remaining self into this act of mental defiance, fighting against the encroaching tendrils of its presence, against the horrific clarity of its intent. The hum wavered. For a split second, it faltered, a gasp of sound rather than a roar. The warped room shuddered, the walls threatening to dissolve entirely. A voice, ancient and vast, speaking directly into the core of my being, weaving a tapestry of forgotten fears, of lost memories, of everything I held dear, twisting them into grotesque shapes, offering a horrifying communion. I pressed harder, my knuckles white, my teeth gritted. No, I breathed. The single word a defiant shield against the onslaught. You will be silent. My vision blurred, tears or something worse stinging my eyes. The world spun, the childhood home collapsing around me, the cyclopean structure rising and falling in my mind like a tormented breath. I was fighting not just for my life, but for the very idea of myself, for the right to be Marcus and nothing more. The hum roared one last time, a final desperate shriek, before. The hum intensified, not merely in volume, but in its very texture. The cyclopean stones of the structure shimmered, their ancient surfaces dissolving like sugar in hot tea. My own hand, raised in a futile attempt to steady myself against the shifting reality, appeared translucent, ghost-like against the swirling gray. The air, once thick with the scent of brine and damp earth, now carried a faint, unsettling aroma of dust and decaying paper, the ghost of an old library. Then, the world fractured. The oppressive weight of the island's stone yielded to the familiar yet subtly wrong embrace of patterned wallpaper. The cold, raw air was replaced by the stale stillness of an enclosed space. I stood, swaying, in what should have been the long, narrow hallway of my childhood home. The coat rack, usually burdened with forgotten scarves, was bare, its hooks glinting like skeletal fingers. My breath hitched. This was my childhood home. Yes, every creak of the floorboards, every faded floral pattern on the wallpaper etched into my memory. But it was wrong. Profoundly, disturbingly wrong. I moved forward, driven by an instinct to confirm the impossible, my footsteps strangely muffled, as if the very air absorbed the sound. I pushed open the door to what should have been the living room, a space filled with the comfortable clutter of family life. This was a deliberate, malevolent reordering. I walked through the inverted spaces, each room a mockery of its true self. The dining room, usually bright with morning light, was a claustrophobic pantry, shelves laden with spectral jars that hummed faintly. The hum was no longer external. It was the sound of a vast, ancient engine turning, grinding away at the edges of my sanity. I pressed my hands to my temples, trying to push against the internal pressure to reassert the known world. I stumbled into a room that, by all logic, should have been my old bedroom. But it was not. It was a vast, echoing chamber, its walls papered not with the familiar faded stripes, but with maps. My maps. Hundreds of them. They stretched from floor to ceiling, unfurling across the ceiling itself, a sprawling, impossible cartography. They were not mere paper and ink. They pulsed with a faint internal luminescence, lines of longitude and latitude shifting, reforming, connecting points that could not exist. The island, the uncharted land, grew and shrank, its contours morphing with each beat of the internal hum. New landmasses, grotesque and angular, bloomed from the ocean depths. And then I saw it, the true horror. Etched into the very fabric of these impossible maps, woven into the swirling patterns of the sea and the jagged lines of new continents, was a single recurring symbol. Not a symbol I had ever drawn, but one I now recognized from the cyclopean structure's intricate carvings. It was a spiral, impossibly complex, unfolding into itself, yet also expanding outwards, infinitely. It was the pattern of the entity. The entity was not merely destroying, it was mapping. It was not just consuming, but integrating. It sought not to annihilate, but to absorb, to extend its consciousness, its very being, across the world, using minds like mine as conduits, as cartographers for its ultimate expansion. This home, this distorted memory, was a crucible. It was here that my perception, my understanding of space and form, was being reprogrammed, realigned to its ancient alien geometry. I was not a victim to be discarded. I was a vessel to be prepared. A silent scream tore through my throat, lost in the overwhelming hum. I tried to rip one of the maps from the wall to tear at the encroaching reality, but my hands passed through the paper as if it were smoke. The spiral symbol pulsed, brighter now in the center of the room, coalescing into a shimmering, indistinct form. It was not a creature, not a monster in any tangible sense, but a vast, intelligent order, an infinitely complex algorithm of existence that sought to impose itself upon all things. My memories, my name, my very sense of self began to fray at the edges, pulled apart by the relentless hum. I was being unmade, then remade, a cog in its incomprehensible design. The maps on the walls pulsed faster, the spiral symbol glowing with an unbearable intensity. Then, a sudden jarring shift. The impossible maps, the distorted home, flickered, wavered, and then, mercifully, dissolved. I found myself lying on the deck of my boat, the Cartographer's Folly, its familiar wooden planks cool beneath my cheek. The salty tang of the North Sea filled my nostrils, and the distant cry of gulls pierced the air. I had escaped. Or had I? My body ached, every muscle protesting, but it was the profound, aching emptiness behind my eyes that truly alarmed me. The island was a hazy, nightmarish memory, its details already beginning to blur. Yet the hum persisted, a soft, insistent whisper in the deepest recesses of my mind, a constant low thrum that was now inextricably part of me. I pushed myself up, my movements stiff, heavy. My eyes fell upon the navigational chart spread across the cabin table, the familiar lines of coastlines and depths. As I looked, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift occurred. Faint, ethereal lines, like the ghost of a pencil stroke, began to appear on the paper, forming impossible connections, tracing new, unknown geographies. They were the spirals, the patterns of the entity, nascent, almost invisible, but undeniably there. I was no longer just Marcus, the reclusive cartographer. I was a carrier, a vessel. The world I knew would be redrawn, and I, irrevocably broken, was its unwitting scribe.